Well, today we're going to revisit a poem which you haven't seen in a little while, and we're going to be talking about the one that will be in your exam by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And this one, which you will instantly be recalling in your minds, is called The Wood Spurge. Now, you might be remembering that this is the initially slightly strange seeming poem, which contains a meditation almost on this object, this kind of flower known as the wood spurge. I'd like to ask you a question about it, and the question that I would like to ask is, to what extent is this object, the wood spurge, symbolic? To what extent is this flower representing something else? And if so, what? Because you might initially note from the title of the poem that it has obviously the word wood in it. Now, we know that, because we've studied this poem, a wood spurge in total is a kind of flower. We know because we've looked it up and because I've told you. Query to what extent Rossetti's audience would have known that the wood spurge was a kind of flower before they read the rest of the poem. So, what I'm saying is that I don't think this flower is particularly well known. It's not a kind of flower that you see all over wallpaper, furniture covers of the time. Rossetti was writing in the pre-Raphaelite era, which was one of a renewed interest in craft, in patterning, in fine painting. And Rossetti spent half his time painting and the other half of the time writing these slightly unconventional poems. So you might imagine that the wood spurge, this flower that he's interested in, is perhaps very familiar to everyone in the period he's writing, in this Victorian pre-Raphaelite period. Maybe everybody's rushing out to B&Q at the weekend to fill up their flower beds in springtime with wood spurge, just like people tend to stand at the edge of their gardens and say, how are the roses coming on, or nice daffodils, or look, some snowdrops. Perhaps all these Victorians were standing around saying to each other, goodness me, I do like the look of your wood spurge. On the other hand, perhaps he's writing about something less well known. It could be less well known in two ways. The first way might be that actually it was well known to him and his friends, him and his, if you like, circle. There's not a very good circle drawn. Or that it was in fact something which had a private meaning to him. And there's always a question of poetry as to what extent it conveys the meaning which was intended by the author, thought of by the author, or to what extent it remains subjective and entirely hidden inside the author's head. So I don't want to start thinking about poetry in terms of puzzles to solve, nor do I want to suggest to you that you should be looking for the clue to the author's inner meaning, because I think that any one poem we read, from Humpty Dumpty to Jack and Jill to Milton's Paradise Lost, or these pre-Raphaelite poems, or any other poem on your anthology, when we're doing that, what we're doing is we are taking a piece of unique insight and expression that comes to us from a poet that has been carefully thought upon, felt about, and written down in a crafted way as an expression of experience, as an expression of insight. That has come to us from the poet, containing all their own interest and issues and values. But at the same time, it is impossible for us to evaluate that on its own terms. So perhaps instead of asking what is the meaning of a poem, we need to ask ourselves what ideas, what values, what experiences are there within this poem for the speaker of the poem, but also for us. Because, for example, if we read Humpty Dumpty in 1,000 years' time, when chickens and eggs have ceased to exist, and in fact the only people populating the earth are cockroaches and Martians, the cockroaches and the Martians will have a very difficult time understanding the place of the nursery food, the egg, the simplest of foods, breakfast food, the fragility also of the egg, they won't be able to understand these meanings that eggs have for us. A simpler example might be, for example, a poem about a dog. When we are little, tend to think of dogs as man's best friend. There are wonderful dogs in lots of literature. There was the very famous dog from TV, Lassie, who used to save everybody. So dogs are man's best friend, dogs are friendly, dogs are fluffy, puppies are cute, etc., etc. But to a Muslim, dogs are unclean animals. So if we were to write a poem about our favourite fluffy puppy and suggest that it is representative of the love and care within our family by describing the upbringing of this puppy, almost as a symbol for the way we care for each other in our families, if we were to do that with our ideas about what dogs represent, cuteness, fluffiness, loo rolls, whoops, going off point there, for a Muslim reading that, they would not necessarily think of it as having the same values. They'd be able to see that we could, but without escaping it in their own mind, there would of course be a whole load of other associations, such as lack of cleanliness, lack of respect, potentially even danger, spiritual conflict, and all of these issues would be raised by the mere introduction of one word, dog. So, coming back to this poem, The Wood Spurge, written by Gabriele Dante Rossetti, Victorian pre-Raphaelite painter and poet. The question is, symbolism? Is it symbolic? Well, the likelihood is, because it's the wood spurge, using the definite article, that we're going to be told there is something very important here going on, very important to someone. On the other hand, we're suggesting that the wood spurge itself is a little-known flower, perhaps even almost a weed, or a common or garden kind of lesser interesting flower. So that would suggest that it's not going to be of great standard significance, such as a cross or a crown or a rose or a jewel or some of these symbols we're familiar with from other literature. But nevertheless, it has meaning for the writer, because otherwise they wouldn't have bothered at all. It's so specific that it must have some form of symbolism. I think we're going to find, and I know from my knowledge of this poem that you're going to find, there's a question of how much it relies on symbolism, and I think that between us we're going to have to work out what do we think for the speaker of this poem it symbolises, but also for ourselves we're going to have to ask the same question. So I'm going to write here, in addition to the symbolism questions, for who, or to be grammatically correct, for whom does this carry these meanings? And fundamentally the thing I'd like to do with you as we read poems is explore. As you go through a poem, which is always written in a number of crafted lines set out in certain ways according to how the poet wishes to do it, we will discover that the lines do run on, the senses, the ideas do build up from the beginning, through the middle of the poem, to the end of the poem. So we need to be thinking about how ideas are introduced, how they are developed, and how they are resolved. This is the fundamental of exploring the way that ideas are actually put to us through a piece of poetry. We may well discover as we do this that there are places within the poem where everything changes or where everything shifts, and we may discover that in fact it's possible to say that in the first stanza these are the main ideas, the main tone, and then we may discover that in the next stanza there is a shift or a development, and we may discover that there are several more of these. So a key skill for you when reading poetry in itself, reading poetry in life, reading poetry out at weddings even, when you're called upon to do that, you need to be reading the poem out first, you need to be thinking in terms of exploring the meanings, the feelings, the tones, You need to be structuring your understanding by having this experience of following through from the beginning, the sentences and the units of meaning all the way through the poem to the end as one long flow, yet also perhaps considering that everything in life, including poems, has an introduction, has a space where things are developed, and has an ending somehow where we have to consider where everything lands up. So, reminding you, teaching to suck eggs there. It's also very useful to do this when you are doing extracts in the exam, because the first thing you can do is read it through in an exploratory way. Then the second thing you can do is cut it up into the sections which you have determined exist within the flow of the poem. And then the third thing that you can do is start to zoom in more closely. So here's a pair of binoculars helping you to zoom in more closely, or perhaps even a magnifying glass, so that you start looking at the details within a section. And Miss Wilson here has just made a classic mistake, which is Miss Wilson began in her discussion of how to look at the close details of this poem with the middle. And of course, because we know that ideas are introduced, developed and resolved, Miss Wilson ought to have started, ta-da, at the beginning. What else might we need to understand this poem? Well, I suppose I was saying to you, was I not, that this is a poem potentially of symbolism and potentially of particular importance to Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and perhaps for us. So you might consider, well, how can I possibly understand what it meant to him if I don't know what the author thought? And this raises the thorny issue of context. To what extent do you need to know about Dante Gabriel Rossetti? And what I'm going to say to you this time is, to be honest, at GCSE, not a lot. I'm also going to say to you that because this poem is actually a self-contained symbolic poem, I don't think that you need to know about a wider system to which it relates. It doesn't refer outwards particularly much to other pieces of literature, so I don't think that you need to have particularly much literary context for it. If you wish, however, to look up, if, however, you would like to look up Rossetti and discover more about him and his context, then I can suggest two excellent places to do this. The first is known as the Victorian Web, www.victorianweb.org, which has the main Victorian writers that you might come across, for example, in Year 12, when you're doing your novel comparison. And certainly if you were to go and do English at university, the chances are you would at least do a term of study on Victorian writers. He is rather fantastic to read about because of his relationship to Christina Rossetti, who we also study a poem by, The Birthday. Also because of his relationship to other arts and crafts painters. So you could look up his visual arts section. You might want to look up the main imagery that he tends to use, and you might want to also look up his biography. However, none of this, although these things are interesting, is actually necessary. So do not waste your time trying to find out facts about Rossetti and making the poem add up as a result of them. The next thing, which you may find useful, is the Poetry Foundation, which has an excellent section on the biography of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. It is a little bit complex, that one, some of the wording, but I think if you do some Velcro reading, zipping through and just finding the things that are of interest to you, then that will do the trick. Some of the things which we're told at the Poetry Foundation, and which we might wish to pay attention to in terms of his context, are that he met Elizabeth Eleanor Siddal, who was about 16 or 17 in the late 1840s. She modelled for Rossetti and married him, but she then lost a child and in fact committed suicide in 1862, and she was rather depressed at the time, clearly, and her death, we are told, pushed Rossetti into deeper melancholy. So he'd always been a slightly melancholic sort of man, and I think that perhaps when we're reading this poem, we might want to keep the mood of the poem very much in mind. He placed manuscripts of his poems on his wife's grave, so perhaps he was kind of given to being, not, I think, depressive, but given to being very loyal. Maybe he was given to being very serious. Maybe he was given to, recollections, nostalgia. He wasn't really a man who easily moved on from things, and these kinds of issues might be useful background for our reading of this poem. I suppose it might be a little bit cheeky to suggest this, but given that he liked to have models that he kept and lived with and remembered for a long time, you might say that he had a sort of slightly obsessive quality. Teeny-weeny bit stalkerish, perhaps? You never know. Anyway, the main thing that we should think about here is his tendency for seriousness. Continuing on, however, I'd like to drop in at this point, of course, the fact that whilst we are now superbly well informed about Rossetti, what the examiner really wants, whilst we are exploring, is that building on our well-informed basis, so we're now very well informed about him for this level of writing, the examiner actually wants, and you're familiar with this sign from my marking, your personal response. So for that reason, if you were to stop this video now and go, yippee, I know all about Rossetti, I can just go and put lots of context in my writing, context, seriousness, painting, la-di-da-di-da, Raphaelites, then I'm afraid you're going to get quite a few crosses from the examiner. Whereas if, on the other hand, you continue having used the context to simply inform yourself, and you zip off and start reading the poem for yourself and really thinking, how do I actually feel? How does the poet seem to feel? Then you're going to get plenty of lovely ticks and a nice high mark. And at this point, it is worth coming round to the poem itself. So we know that the title is The Woodspurge. Let's now do that whole business of reading through from, as I suggested before is necessary, the beginning, through the middle of the poem, right down to the end. And I think we'll just use the pointer here to show what we're doing. Reading it out loud, as I'm about to do, is absolutely the best way. When you're in the exam and you see it in front of you, then absolutely the best thing you can do is to read it out loud in your head, thinking about the tone, thinking about the question that you've been given. I think it's possible that the kind of question you might get here would be, explore how the poet conveys his sad state of mind in this poem. But you could also get, explore how the poet conveys his state of mind, without the word sad in there. You could always get, discuss the lines which you find most memorably striking, or most powerful, or the most vivid imagery. Any of these could be a question you could get on this poem. So bearing that in mind, here we go. The Woodspurge. The wind flapped loose. The wind was still. Shaken out dead from tree and hill, I had walked on at the wind's will. I sat now, for the wind was still. Between my knees my forehead was, my lips drawn in said not alas, my hair was over in the grass, my naked ears heard the day pass. My eyes, wide open, had the run of some 10 weeds to fix upon. Among those few, out of the sun, the woodspurge flowered, 3 cups in one. From perfect grief there need not be wisdom or even memory. One thing, then, learnt remains to me. The woodspurge has a cup of 3. So at this point we might say to ourselves, okay, what did I get out of that? Well, I certainly in my first reading had a distinct sensation of sadness, and I think this was coming up here. with the repeated idea of the wind here. And I think it's the verbs that were the clue to me. The wind flapped. It was still. It was shaken out, and worse than that, shaken out dead from tree and hill. So flapped loose, it seems to have run away. The wind seems to have disappeared. Even the wind has left him. Flapped, some movement, sounds a bit random. Was still, sounds like a moment of delicious pause, quite comfortable, sitting on the end of the line there. Still, quite like that, thank you, quite happy with that, no problem. Trouble is, actually it's been shaken, and it's been shaken out dead from tree and hill, so it has gone. So I start feeling a bit weird, a little uncertain. I start feeling quite happy towards the end of the line, and then I have a sudden abrupt change to feeling pretty uncomfortable. This is an unpleasant pause. We're then drawn to the pronouns, which focus us very much more on the speaker of the poem. I had walked on at the wind's will, and I sat now, for the wind was still. It's almost like there's a competition going on between I, the persona, the speaker of the poem, and natural powers, the power of the universe, because it's the will, the desire of the wind, which is in conflict with the man. He walked so long as the wind let him, and now he sat because the wind was still. And if we are following through from the beginning to the middle and the end, through the sentences, the wind flapped loose, the wind was still, shaken out dead from tree and hill, colon, a scene setting, first part of the sentence, through that to the main part of the sentence with the subject and the verb, I, and the person doing it, I had walked on because of the way the wind wanted me to, and then there's a hyphen telling us the sentence is continuing, and now I sat because the wind was still. Following that logic through, setting the scene, saying what I was doing and why, saying what I was doing and why, it seems that there is a sense of trying to get somewhere, trying to do something, but in fact ending up contemplating still, with this hideous kind of experience of some sort of deep loss in the middle, signified, I think, by the idea that the wind had been shaken out dead. We have a simple rhyme going on between still, hill, will, still. It rhymes, 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 all the same, so the rhyme scheme is A, 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 and that itself mirrors the stillness which he's feeling, the lack of progress, I think we could say, with my dreadful writing. There we go. Between my knees my forehead was, we're then told. Okay, so if we go back to reading through for units of sense, we can see from the full stop here, the capital letter there, then the hyphen, exclamation mark, but I think this is the kind of exclamation mark, potentially, which actually interrupts a sentence, as was occasionally still the case in the 19th century. So this is potentially one sentence, or potentially the first half of a sentence. Then it continues and continues. We see my lips, my hair, my naked ears. So this is a list. So let's read it through. Between my knees my forehead was, my lips drawn in said not alas, my hair was over in the grass, my naked ears heard the day pass. What happens? Again, let's look at the verbs and see if they help us. Between my knees my forehead was, there it is, my lips drawn in, they were drawn in, and they said something, oh no, they said not alas, so he's not even breathing anything out. He's got his head between his legs, crouching down. Let's draw him here, like this, I think. He's got an incredibly long neck, but he seems to be like this, sitting in the grass with his head here, and his hair seems to be all over the grass like that. There we go. Let's draw some grass to sit him on, shall we? Here he is, sitting on some grass, with his head staring down. So, my lips drawn in said not alas, my hair was over in the grass, my naked ears heard the day pass. Right, well that's quite positive, I think. He's still got ears. Give him an ear. Here's a great big ear for him. Looks like an elephant now. But they're not hearing anything very interesting. It's the day passing by. So again, if we look back at these rhymes and these verbs, was, no verb but alas, was, alas, grass, pass, was, a loss, grass, pass. Well, this is more open, but again, we've got the same rhyme scheme going on. There is still not very much progress. There's a bit of unevenness, but still no progress. Looking at the rest of the grammar of this part, I think it's important that his head is between his knees and forehead, but this almost becomes symbolic of him being between two places, between the past and the future, between comfort and discomfort. I think the listing of knees, forehead, lips, hair, ears, he's very acutely physically aware. But I think we're going to say, how does he feel physically? Well, you only put your head between your knees, don't you, when you're feeling dizzy or awful or very, very sad indeed. And also, I think it's important that his ears are naked, which is suggesting vulnerability. The lips are drawn tight, so he's not speaking, not letting anything out. And his hair is all over the place. So he's physically vulnerable, I think. He's potentially distraught. Now we can see, what else do we have? My eyes. He has got his eyes, and the eyes are the only thing here that are paying attention. His eyes are wide open. Great big eyes. Staring. They had the run of some 10, maidens to look at, books to read, nope, weeds to fix upon. So there's a sense here of him grasping whatever he can get. He's grasping with his eye, fixing, but he is fixing merely on weeds. So he's desperate for value and trying to find value in whatever he can see in front of them. We then have a situation where we're taken through, and if we read through the next part, what it is that he sees. Among those few, the weeds, out of the sun, I suppose they're not in the sun partly because they're under his head, but maybe they're hidden away in the grass as well. The wood spurge flowered, 3 cups in one. So if you imagine him sitting there seeing 10 weeds, in the middle of all these weeds, which aren't particularly pleasurable, they're just kind of nasty, tangly, rubbishy sort of little bits of flower, we've got this thing called a wood spurge, so he's obviously familiar with it. And what is it doing? It's flowering. But not only is it flowering, it seems to be actually doing it 3 times over. It's also shaped like a cup, and it's got 3 cups in one. So that's a bit like somebody coming these days. It makes me think of someone coming to offer me a cup of tea to cheer me up at the end of a long day, or something like that. But they're not just offering me 1 cup, they're actually offering me 3 cups of tea. So somehow, perhaps this wood spurge begins to be some kind of image or symbol of comfort, of fullness, of possibility, of fulfilment, maybe. Things are looking up for Dante. Good job, because frankly I was being a bit sad. Especially when we look here that we're told they're doing it out of the sun. So symbolically, does this perhaps mean, even in a situation where there's nothing but weeds around to look at, even where there's just a few things to comfort you, even when the only thing you can bear to open is your eyes, even when all of this is happening out away from the sunlight, the wonderful life-giving power of nature, and all you can find is a tiny little insignificant thing, it nevertheless can flower, and it can offer in itself many things and much comfort. Let's see if the rest of the poem goes with this interpretation. He moves on into a new stanza and says, "From perfect grief there need not be wisdom or even memory. One thing then learnt remains to me, the wood spurge has a cup of 3. Oh, so he doesn't actually finish up with, "Yay, I feel marvellous now, I feel great, life is fine, I've seen 3 shining green cups in the grass, and this symbolises my 3 friends, or the Holy Ghost, the Spirit, and God." No, none of that. But I think there is nonetheless a sort of sense of contentment. He seems to be content in this kind of sense of discovery. Perhaps he said earlier that his eyes had something to fix upon, and now we can see that what he has fixed on was the wood spurge, and what he has learnt about the wood spurge is that it has 3 cups. He's just got some satisfaction from focusing in on the tiny little details, the tiny little subtleties of what he can see. And I think this has got to be significant somehow. I think it's also interesting that we then get these pronouns telling us there's movement going on. So, from perfect grief, there need not be wisdom. The line is unjummed. There need not be, total improvement, a great big party, an enjoyable marriage. From perfect grief, there need not be wisdom. Oh, actually, we don't need any great deep learning or even memory. Oh, okay, so we don't need to look at the wood spurge and remember back to the person that we're missing or the experience we're regretting. We don't need to be wise, we don't need to remember the past. This seems to be his realisation in the poem. This seems to be the big moment of realisation. If it was a sonnet, it would be like a kind of turn. So I've learnt, he says, that I don't need perfect grief to lead me to wisdom or memory, but I have learnt one thing, and it remains to me, and remains rather suggests that whatever else was taken away, there is something still here, there is still something you can discover, and in this case it is that a wood spurge happens to have 3 cups, 3 little leaves inside itself. Does that matter? This is the question left to us. If we go back to my question right at the start, to what extent is this poem symbolic? And how? It seems to make an almost meaningless statement at the end. But I think what it's showing is that from this whole experience of when everything has flapped or shaken or disappeared or died, when these things have happened, when one is at the mercy of the will of something else, of fate or life, when one has been reduced to having your head between your knees and the only thing you can open are your eyes, when all of this has happened, and when the life-giving power of the sun has disappeared, we are still able to notice the world around us. And even if this doesn't leave some great, massive, earth-shattering understanding, it is still possible for us to have in ourselves personal experience or personal understanding which is somehow restorative, somehow makes us feel better. And in this case, that is perhaps what this little bit of learning that the wood spurge has a cup of 3 is giving us. The idea that there can be more to life even in the small things. And at this point, it might be worth having a little look at a wood spurge itself. So here is an image of one, and we can see that it is an unassuming little flower, but a rather pretty one. It has a sort of delicacy about it, and we can see it has quite beautifully shaped leaves here. It has a very small flower, and in order to see it, you really would have to fix your eye upon it and look quite closely, I think. It also has this very intricate kind of pattern with the 1, 2, 3 leaves all in one. This might be a good time to ask, what would this plant mean to you? What would this plant mean to you? What does this poem mean to you? What do you think it may have meant to the poet? And to what extent and how is it symbolic? A good way to sum up your feeling about the poem is to try to write a paragraph about it, perhaps like this. The wood spurge is clearly a symbolic poem, but perhaps not offering up the flower itself as a symbol of the power of nature, instead, it seems to me that Rossetti is exploring here how the ability to notice nature can be restorative. How in the world there can be moments of discovery which help us to move outside our own private griefs. The poet takes us through an experience of wandering, grief-stricken, or maybe even wandering, distraught and grief-stricken. At the will of the wind, or indeed fate, having lost his own sense of personal direction, and through feeling becalmed, contemplating death, or contemplating loss and arguably death, in a lonely mental space. He draws a picture, or he draws a moving picture of crouching, hiding, and holding in the personal pain of loss, but then being drawn out of this through the contemplation of the most ordinary of weeds, the wood spurge. The poem memorably symbolises the potential for hope. Through this. Otherwise insignificant image. And I think that makes a good introduction to any kind of essay, or to summing up your personal feeling about the relevant poem and question. What you would then need to do to trace the idea through is, as we said at the start, to explore stanza and sentence by stanza and sentence from, as we also said at the beginning through the middle to the end of the poem.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.